I am Clara, 33 years old, and until last Saturday, I was my family's personal bank account. I stood in the shadows of a luxury ballroom watching my mother grab the microphone at my brother's wedding. She pointed her champagne flute right at me and announced to 300 elite guests that while I was hopelessly single, at least I was good for signing massive checks to keep everyone happy. The entire room erupted in laughter. They did not know my name was deliberately left off the wedding program for the $150,000 event I fully funded. But the true betrayal came 20 minutes later in the bridal suite when a dropped briefcase revealed a $2.5 million secret that would send my own flesh and blood to federal prison. Growing up in Atlanta, my mother Beatrice was obsessed with high society. When my parents declared bankruptcy 10 years ago to save face in their country club circles, I became the designated survivor. I built a supply chain software company from the ground up, working 90-hour weeks until it became a massive success. Meanwhile, my older brother Harrison, who is 35, remained the golden child. He was handsome, charismatic, and completely incapable of holding down a steady job. I funded his 5 failed startups because family is supposed to support family. His newest venture was marrying Jasmine. Jasmine is a stunning African-American woman from a highly respected old money family in the Cascade neighborhood. Her family brought the social prestige my mother desperately craved. I was expected to bring the cash. The ballroom at the St. Regis was spectacular. I had paid for the custom designer gown, the imported white orchids draping from the ceiling, and the top-tier open bar. Yet when I arrived, I found I had no seat at the VIP family tables near the stage. I was shoved in the back corner next to the kitchen doors. Then came my mother's toast. She stood on the stage, her diamond necklace sparkling under the lights, and delivered her humiliating punchline about my relationship status. I did not cry. I had stopped shedding tears over my mother's blatant favoritism years ago. But the sheer audacity of publicly degrading the woman funding the very floor they were dancing on struck a raw nerve. I crumpled the gold-foiled wedding program in my hand. The sharp edges bit into my palm. I turned away from the laughing crowd and marched straight toward the bridal suite. It was time to set a firm boundary. I pushed open the heavy oak doors. Harrison and Jasmine had slipped away from the stage for a wardrobe change before their first dance. Harrison was adjusting his expensive bow tie in the full-length mirror. I stepped into the room and told him we needed to talk immediately. Harrison did not even flinch. He waved his hand dismissively, telling me not to make a big deal out of nothing, and that he was about to go out there to dance with his wife. I glanced at Jasmine. She was sitting on a velvet chaise lounge while 2 stylists pinned up the train of her second expensive dress for the evening. I reminded Harrison that his wife's entire wedding was funded by me, and the least he could do was ensure I had a seat at a table, let alone ask our mother to stop using me as a public punchline. Jasmine waved off her stylists and stood up. Her sweet, radiant bride persona vanished instantly. She looked at me with polished condescension. She told me I needed to know my place. She said I was just the financial backer, and because I did not have a husband or a family of my own, providing for Harrison and his future children was my absolute duty to the family name. She asked what else I was going to spend my money on. The sheer entitlement was suffocating. They were not just ungrateful, they actively viewed my wealth as their birthright, simply because I was a single woman. I asked her if she truly thought my hard-earned money was her inherent right. Jasmine just smiled, looped her arm through Harrison's, and told me to go back out there, grab a drink, and enjoy the party I bought because they had important guests to entertain. They brushed past me, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and absolute arrogance in their wake. I stood alone in this bridal suite, the silence buzzing in my ears. The urge to walk out of the hotel, get in my car, and never speak to them again was overwhelming. I moved toward the corner table to grab my clutch, intent on doing exactly that. As I pulled my bag from the chair, the strap caught on the handle of Harrison's thick leather briefcase resting on the edge of the table. It tumbled to the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The unclasped latch sprang open, spilling papers all across the floor. I knelt to gather them, muttering under my breath about the mess, but as my fingers brushed the top document, my blood ran cold. Printed at the top of the thick packet was the logo of my company, my logistics tech firm. Underneath it was a commercial mortgage approval letter from a major national bank. I sat back on my heels, my eyes scanning the text. My heart began to hammer fiercely against my ribs. This was not a business proposal. This was not Harrison pitching another terrible application idea. It was a commercial guarantee. I flipped through the pages, my breath catching in my throat. Harrison and Jasmine had just closed on a sprawling 8,000-square-foot mansion in Buckhead. The purchase price was $2.5 million, but Harrison did not have the credit or the income to secure a loan of that magnitude. Jasmine's family had prestige, but their assets were tied up in generational trusts. I looked at the signature line on the bank document. There, in black ink, was my exact signature. Next to it was my highly confidential Social Security number. Attached to the back of the packet were forged corporate documents listing Harrison as a managing partner of my company, officially using my firm's corporate assets as collateral for the massive mortgage. And there was something else that made my stomach turn. Beatrice had notarized it. My own mother, a licensed notary in the state of Georgia, had stamped the fraudulent documents. They had not just humiliated me. They had not just used me to pay for an extravagant wedding. They had committed federal identity theft and mortgage fraud. If Harrison defaulted on this $2.5 million mansion, which he absolutely would given his disastrous financial track record, the bank would seize my company. The business I had spent a decade building from the ground up, the business that employed 50 innocent people, would be liquidated to pay for my brother's house. They had essentially stolen my entire life's work while I was sitting outside watching them drink champagne. I slowly folded the papers back into the briefcase and stood up. The hurt I had felt 5 minutes ago evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold and calculating fury. I pulled my phone from my clutch and dialed a number. David, my wealth manager and lead attorney, answered on the second ring. I told him I needed him to pull up my corporate credit files and personal alerts right now, and I did not care that it was Saturday night. David's voice was instantly alert, asking me what was going on. I stared at the door leading back to the ballroom. My family did not just cross a line tonight, I told him. They committed a felony, and I am going to tear their entire lives apart. David inhaled sharply over the line. I could hear the rapid clatter of his keyboard as he pulled up my secure financial dashboard. Seconds later, he confirmed my worst nightmare. A massive commercial mortgage had been finalized on Friday afternoon. My signature, my corporate tax identification number, and my personal Social Security number were all on the digital file. Harrison had officially listed himself as the majority shareholder of my logistics company to back the loan, and Beatrice had authenticated the entire fraudulent packet. David told me we needed to contact federal authorities immediately because this was a major federal crime. I agreed, but I gave him a very specific set of instructions first. I told David to freeze every single credit account connected to my name. I ordered him to revoke the secondary platinum cards I had generously given my mother and brother years ago. Then I told him to look at the pending charges for the St. Regis Hotel. Half of the wedding had been paid up front, but the remaining $75,000 for the reception, the open bar, and the catering was scheduled to process tonight. I instructed David to flag that transaction as unauthorized and block the payment. David warned me that doing so would immediately shut down the wedding reception and humiliate my family in front of Atlanta high society. I smiled at my reflection in the bridal suite mirror and told him that was exactly the point. Before David could reply, loud pounding rattled the oak doors of the bridal suite. Beatrice's shrill voice pierced through the heavy wood, demanding to know why I was hiding. I ended the call, slipped my phone back into my clutch, and unlocked the door. My mother barged in, her face flushed with irritation. She looked me up and down, her lips curling in disgust. She scolded me for wasting time saying Jasmine's family was waiting in the grand foyer for the official portraits. She reminded me to stand in the back row because my single status ruined the aesthetic of a successful, thriving family unit. 10 minutes ago, those words would have felt like a knife to the chest. Now, looking at the woman who had just facilitated the theft of my entire life's work, I felt absolutely nothing. I nodded politely and followed her out to the foyer. The photographer was arranging the families on the grand sweeping staircase. Jasmine's parents stood at the center, radiating elegance and generational wealth. Her father was a highly respected cardiovascular surgeon, and her mother was a retired judge. They were the epitome of Cascade old money, graceful and commanding. As Beatrice approached, Jasmine's parents smiled warmly. Jasmine's father shook my mother's hand and thanked her for the incredibly generous $2.5 million mansion. He praised Harrison, calling him a remarkable young man and a brilliant financial mind to secure such a beautiful home for their daughter. Beatrice preened, soaking up the praise like a sponge. She puffed out her chest and took absolute credit for everything. She loudly proclaimed that Harrison was the true financial pillar of our family, a self-made genius who knew how to handle real wealth. Jasmine's mother turned her attention to me, offering a polite smile, and asked what I did for a living. Before I could even open my mouth, Beatrice waved her hand dismissively. She told them I just tinkered with supply chain software on my computer, and that I lacked the business acumen to understand high-level investments like Harrison did. Jasmine's parents offered me a look of polite pity. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I simply smiled a bright, predatory smile and told Jasmine's parents that Harrison was certainly about to experience a massive return on his investments. The reception kicked off with a lavish display of wealth. Waiters circulated with silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. The 10-piece live band played beautifully as the 300 VIP guests mingled. I stood near the ice sculpture, quietly sipping sparkling water, waiting for the first domino to fall. It did not take long. I watched the St. Regis event director march through the ballroom doors. The color was completely drained from his face. He moved quickly toward the head table where Beatrice was holding court with the local politicians. He leaned down and whispered frantically into my mother's ear. Beatrice's haughty laugh echoed over the music. She pulled a designer wallet from her purse and handed the director a heavy metal credit card. I knew that card. It was the secondary account I had issued her for emergencies years ago. The director nodded and rushed away. Exactly 8 minutes later, he returned. This time he was not whispering. He looked desperate. I watched his mouth move from across the room, telling her the card had declined again. Beatrice's face went rigid. She argued with him, insisting there must be a bank error, but the director shook his head firmly. He delivered the ultimatum: if the $75,000 balance was not settled immediately, the kitchen would stop serving the main course, the bar would close, and the band would be instructed to pack up their instruments. Panic washed over Beatrice's face. The wealthy matriarch facade completely shattered. She frantically rummaged through her purse, pulling out her own personal credit cards, but we both knew she was swimming in debt. Her cards would not even cover the cost of the floral centerpieces. Jasmine and Harrison noticed the commotion and walked over to the table. As the event director explained the situation to the groom, Harrison's confident swagger evaporated. He looked terrified. Beatrice frantically scanned the massive ballroom. Her eyes darted past the politicians, past the surgeons, past the judges, searching desperately for her abandoned daughter. She was looking for her walking ATM. When her eyes finally locked onto mine across the room, I raised my glass of sparkling water in a mock toast. The financial oxygen had been cut and the suffocation was just beginning. Beatrice did not walk across the ballroom. She marched. Her designer heels struck the marble floor with a frantic rhythm that completely betrayed her carefully cultivated high society image. Guests continued to laugh and clink their champagne flutes, completely oblivious to the financial catastrophe unfolding right beside the ice sculpture. I took another slow sip of my sparkling water and watched my mother approach. Her face was a mask of sheer panic, tightly pulled over seething rage. She reached me and immediately grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging sharply into my skin. She hissed under her breath, demanding to know what was wrong with the card. She claimed the bank was making a humiliating mistake and ordered me to give her my primary black card instantly before Jasmine's parents noticed the catering staff packing up the buffet stations. Her voice was trembling. For the first time in my entire life, Beatrice was not looking down at me with condescension. She was looking at me with raw, unfiltered desperation. I calmly looked down at the hand gripping my arm. I told her to let go of me. I spoke quietly, but the absolute ice in my tone made her flinch. She slowly released her grip, leaving faint red crescent marks on my skin. I informed her there was no bank error. I told her I had personally instructed my wealth manager to freeze every single account associated with my name, including the secondary cards she and Harrison had been treating like their own personal lottery funds for the past decade. Beatrice stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend the words. She demanded to know if I had lost my mind. She gestured wildly toward the center of the room where Harrison and Jasmine were trying to maintain their smiles while the event director hovered nearby. She whispered that this was the most important night of my brother's life and that I was intentionally ruining the family name out of petty jealousy. Harrison finally broke away from his bride and hurried over to us. He was sweating profusely. His expensive tuxedo collar was suddenly looking very tight around his neck. He asked me what game I was playing. He begged me to just hand over another card to settle the remaining $75,000 so the band would keep playing. He promised he would pay me back the moment he secured funding for his next business venture. It was the same hollow promise he had been making since he was 20 years old. I looked at my brother, taking in his panicked expression. I asked him if he planned to pay me back before or after the bank foreclosed on his new 8,000-square-foot mansion in Buckhead. The effect of those words was instantaneous. All the blood drained from Harrison's face. He looked as though the floor had just vanished beneath his feet. Beatrice physically stumbled back a step, her eyes darting nervously around the ballroom to see if anyone had heard me. Harrison choked on his words, asking how I could possibly know about the house. I explained that he really should be more careful with his personal belongings. I told them about the bridal suite. I detailed exactly how his leather briefcase had tumbled off the table and how the latch had popped open to reveal the massive commercial mortgage approval resting right on top. I kept my voice perfectly level as I described the forged corporate documents. I recited the exact loan amount of $2.5 million. I noted the specific use of my company's assets as collateral. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and mentioned her official notary stamp validating my forged signature. Beatrice tried to recover her footing. She plastered on a fake shaky smile and lowered her voice to a desperate whisper. She told me I was overreacting to a simple family business arrangement. She tried to justify the federal crime by claiming that since I had no husband and no children to provide for, it was only fair that my wealth helped secure the legacy of my brother. She actually had the audacity to call it an advance on my inevitable contribution to my future nephew. She promised that once Jasmine's family saw the grand estate, they would invest in Harrison's next company, and the mortgage would be transferred out of my name entirely. It was a staggering display of delusion. They had convinced themselves that stealing my identity and risking the livelihoods of my 50 employees was nothing more than a temporary family loan. Harrison reached out, trying to place a placating hand on my shoulder. He told me we could discuss the logistics tomorrow. He pleaded with me to just fix the catering bill right now so he would not be humiliated in front of his new in-laws. He said we were family, and family protects each other. I stepped back from his reach. I told him he lost the right to use the word family the moment he forged my signature on federal bank documents. I informed them both that David was already compiling the evidence. The commercial guarantee was fraudulent, the notary stamp was an accessory to a felony, and the bank would be notified the moment their offices opened on Monday morning. I watched the realization finally settle into their eyes. There was no negotiation happening here. There was no safety net left to catch them. The event director reappeared beside us, his patience completely exhausted. He addressed my mother, stating that the grace period had expired. He informed her that the kitchen staff was currently pulling the main courses from the warming ovens, and the bar was officially closed. Several guests nearby began to murmur, noticing that the bartenders were pulling the metal grates down over the liquor displays. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing mid-song, leaving a heavy, awkward silence blanketing the opulent room. Jasmine's parents, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, began walking toward our corner. Their faces displayed a mixture of confusion and elite displeasure. Beatrice let out a soft, terrified whimpering sound. She begged me to do something to save them from this disgrace. I looked at the stage where a single microphone stood resting on its stand. I told my mother she was absolutely right earlier. I told her I did know how to sign beautiful checks to keep this family smiling, but tonight my checkbook was officially closed. I turned my back on their pale, terrified faces. I did not walk toward the exit. Instead, I began walking straight through the crowd, heading directly for the abandoned microphone on the center stage. It was time for the whole room to understand exactly who had been funding this illusion. I stepped onto the polished wood of the center stage. The heels of my shoes clicked sharply against the sudden and oppressive silence of the ballroom. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold metal of the microphone. I tapped the silver mesh grill once. A sharp burst of feedback echoed through the massive room, causing several guests in the front row to wince and cover their ears. Every single eye in the St. Regis ballroom turned toward me. The live band members who had been awkwardly packing away their instruments froze in place. At the far end of the room, near the melting swan ice sculpture, my brother Harrison and my mother Beatrice stood absolutely paralyzed. They looked like cornered animals, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. I looked out over the sea of 300 elite guests. I saw politicians, real estate developers, and wealthy socialites staring back at me with expressions of mild confusion. I brought the microphone closer to my mouth and took a deep, steadying breath. "Good evening, everyone." I began, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Clara. I am Harrison's younger sister. I am the woman my mother Beatrice just joked about being aggressively single during her champagne toast. She was absolutely right about one thing: I do not have a husband. What I do have is a highly successful supply chain software company, a pristine credit score, and an unblemished criminal record. Unfortunately, as of this afternoon, my brother and my mother can no longer say the same." A collective gasp rippled through the elegant crowd. Whispers broke out among the tables covered in white orchids and imported silk linens. I saw Jasmine, the radiant bride, suddenly hiking up the heavy skirt of her designer gown and marching furiously toward the stage. Her face was contorted with pure panic. She hissed at me to stop talking and demanded someone cut the audio. I completely ignored her and turned my gaze directly to the front VIP table where her parents were sitting. Jasmine's father, a highly respected cardiovascular surgeon, and her mother, a retired judge, were staring at me with profound alarm. I addressed them directly, speaking with utmost clarity so the microphone carried every single syllable to the very back of the room. "I want to sincerely apologize for interrupting this beautiful reception," I told them. "But as people of high standing and integrity, you deserve to know the absolute truth about the family your daughter just married into. Earlier this evening, you thanked my mother for the incredibly generous gift of a $2.5 million mansion in Buckhead. You praised Harrison as a brilliant financial mind who secured a beautiful future for your daughter. I am so sorry to tell you this, but everything you have been told is a fabricated lie. Harrison is completely broke. He has failed at 5 consecutive business ventures, all of which I personally funded to keep him afloat." The silence in the room was now deafening. Jasmine had reached the bottom of the stage stairs, but she was frozen, her eyes darting between me and her parents. "To secure the commercial mortgage for that massive estate," I continued, "my brother committed federal identity theft. He broke into my corporate files and forged my signature on a commercial guarantee. He illegally listed himself as the majority shareholder of my logistics tech firm, using my corporate assets and my personal Social Security number as collateral for a $2.5 million loan he could never afford to repay." I paused, letting the magnitude of the crime sink in. I looked past the stage and locked eyes with my mother. Beatrice was trembling so violently she had to lean against a cocktail table to keep from collapsing to the marble floor. "And the worst part of this betrayal," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality, "is that my own mother facilitated the crime. Beatrice is a licensed notary in the state of Georgia. She deliberately used her official notary stamp to authenticate those forged documents. They committed severe mortgage fraud to buy a house just to impress your family and maintain their country club facade. They willingly risked the livelihoods of the 50 innocent employees who work for my company just so Harrison could play the role of a wealthy tech mogul." Jasmine's father abruptly stood up from his chair. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury. He turned around and glared directly at Harrison. He demanded to know if a single word of this was true. Harrison stammered, raising his hands in a defensive gesture, but no coherent words came out of his mouth. Jasmine tried to salvage the disaster. She looked up at me and yelled that I was a bitter, jealous liar trying to ruin her perfect day because I was miserable and alone. I looked down at my new sister-in-law with nothing but pity. I told the room that Jasmine was fully aware of the financial abuse. I explained that she had confronted me in the bridal suite just an hour ago, telling me that because I was single, providing luxury for her, and Harrison was my inherent duty to the family name. She believed my company was her personal piggy bank. I swept my gaze across the entire ballroom one last time, ensuring everyone was listening closely. I pointed toward the closed bars and the empty catering stations. You may have noticed the bartenders pulling down the grates and the kitchen staff packing up the main courses, I announced. That is because I finally cut off the financial oxygen. I paid $150,000 to give them this dream wedding, but I absolutely refused to pay the final $75,000 balance when I discovered they had stolen my identity. The black credit card my mother just desperately tried to use to keep the liquor flowing belonged to me, and I canceled it 20 minutes ago. The crowd exploded into chaotic murmurs. Guests were pulling out their phones, texting furiously, and openly staring at Beatrice and Harrison. Jasmine's mother, the retired judge, stood up slowly, her face etched with absolute disgust. She told her husband to get their coats because they were leaving immediately. I looked back at my brother and my mother. I told them that my wealth manager and legal counsel had already compiled the forged documents. I promised them that federal authorities and the bank's fraud department would be notified the second offices opened on Monday morning. I wished them the best of luck dealing with the immediate foreclosure of their stolen mansion and the impending federal indictments. I did not wait for a response. I dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, heavy thud that reverberated through the sound system. I walked down the side stairs, my head held high, and strode straight down the center aisle. The sea of shocked Atlanta socialites parted for me instantly. No one said a word as I walked out the heavy oak doors, leaving the ruins of my toxic family behind me forever. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the St. Regis and stepped out into the warm, humid Atlanta night. The heavy scent of magnolias hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the suffocating perfume and sheer panic I had just left behind in the ballroom. The valet rushed forward, his eyes wide. He had likely heard the booming feedback from the microphone or seen the sheer chaos erupting through the glass windows. He brought my car around swiftly, his movements hurried and nervous. I tipped him a $100 bill, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the heavy door. The thick soundproofing of the vehicle instantly muted the noise of the hotel entrance. I took one deep, steadying breath. The adrenaline that had fueled my stage performance was beginning to recede, leaving behind a razor-sharp clarity. I pressed the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and tapped the steering wheel screen to dial David. He answered on the very first ring. He did not say hello. He simply stated that he had the entire fraudulent file open on his monitors, and the situation was far worse than we initially thought. I steered the car onto Peachtree Road, the streetlights reflecting off the polished hood. I asked him to give me the exact damage. David's voice was tense but highly professional, the tone of a man preparing for absolute corporate warfare. He explained that Harrison did not just forge a simple personal loan document. He had created a highly sophisticated web of fake corporate resolutions. David detailed how my brother had fabricated official board meeting minutes. Harrison had drafted legal documents falsely claiming my logistics technology firm was aggressively expanding into commercial real estate holdings. He used those fake minutes to authorize my company to act as the sole financial guarantor for the $2.5 million residential property in Buckhead. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I asked David how a major national bank could possibly approve such a massive commercial guarantee without verbally verifying it with me, the actual registered chief executive officer. David let out a heavy sigh over the speakers. That was exactly where my mother came in. Beatrice did not just use her notary stamp on the final signature page. She had actively authenticated a completely fabricated power of attorney document. Beatrice had legally sworn under penalty of perjury that I had granted Harrison full executive authority to sign sweeping financial instruments on behalf of my company. Because Beatrice had maintained a pristine record as a notary public for over 20 years in the state of Georgia, the bank loan officers accepted her embossed seal without question. They bypassed the standard secondary verbal verification protocols because the power of attorney looked absolutely flawless and was validated by a trusted state official. I felt a cold, hard smile forming on my lips. I asked David what the legal penalty was for a licensed notary committing that level of intentional fraud. David did not hesitate for a single second. He told me it was a federal offense. Because the bank was federally insured and the loan involved electronic wire transfers across state lines, we were looking at severe charges of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He informed me that Harrison and Beatrice were facing mandatory minimum prison sentences. This was no longer a petty civil family dispute over borrowed money or wedding expenses. It was a major federal crime, and they had handed us all the evidence on a silver platter. I pulled onto the highway heading toward my penthouse in Midtown. I gave David his marching orders. I told him we were not waiting until Monday morning to start the fire. I instructed him to draft the formal affidavits immediately. I needed sworn statements declaring that I never authorized the power of attorney and that my signatures were entirely forged. David agreed without hesitation, stating he would have his entire team of paralegals working through the night to compile the evidence binder. David then gave me a crucial directive. He told me I needed to file an official police report for identity theft tonight. Not tomorrow, not Monday. Tonight. He explained that establishing a concrete timeline was absolutely critical. By filing the report within hours of discovering the dropped briefcase in the bridal suite, we created an undeniable paper trail that protected my company from liability. If the bank tried to seize my corporate assets to cover Harrison's inevitable default, the police report would serve as an impenetrable legal shield against their claims. As we spoke, my car dashboard began lighting up with incoming calls and text messages. My screen flashed with Harrison's name, then Beatrice's name, and then several unknown local numbers. I ignored all of them. I told David my phone was currently exploding with desperate messages from the exact people who just tried to ruin my life. David instructed me not to answer a single call under any circumstances. He told me to let every call go to voicemail and to take immediate screenshots of every text message. He said desperate people make terrible mistakes, and in their blind panic they would likely confess to the entire fraud in writing. I navigated the familiar streets of Midtown Atlanta, pulling into the highly secure underground parking garage of my high-rise building. The heavy steel gate closed behind me, completely shutting out the rest of the world. I parked my car and took the private elevator directly to my top-floor apartment. As the doors opened into my sanctuary, I told David I was home and safe. I promised to forward him every voicemail and text message as soon as I walked through the door. David assured me that my company was perfectly secure. He promised that the bank's fraud department would receive our comprehensive legal package the very second their doors opened on Monday morning. He also mentioned that he had already contacted a close colleague who specialized in white-collar criminal defense. He did this not to hire him for us, but to consult on exactly how the FBI field office in Atlanta handles high-profile mortgage fraud cases. We were going to hand the federal investigators a perfectly tied bow of devastating evidence. I thanked David for his relentless dedication and hung up the phone. I walked over to my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glowing, vibrant skyline of Atlanta. I poured myself a glass of cold water, set my phone on the marble kitchen island, and watched as the screen lit up with another frantic text message from my mother. The message simply read that she was begging me to call her back because Jasmine's father had just threatened to call the police on Harrison. The dominoes were officially falling, and I had never felt so powerfully in control of my own life. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone resting on the marble kitchen island. The text message from my mother sat there, a digital testament to her collapsing world. Jasmine's father had threatened to call the police. I took a slow sip of my water, savoring the absolute silence of my penthouse. For the first time in my life, I was not rushing to put out their fires. I tapped the screen and opened my voicemail inbox. There were 14 new messages. I pressed play on the first one, placing the phone on speaker so her voice could fill the empty room. Beatrice's voice echoed through the high-fidelity speakers. She did not sound apologetic. She sounded deeply inconvenienced. She started the message with a heavy, dramatic sigh, utilizing that signature tone she always reserved for scolding a disobedient child. She ordered me to stop throwing a temper tantrum and return to the hotel immediately. She claimed Jasmine was crying in the bridal suite and Harrison was having a panic attack. Beatrice insisted that I needed to call the bank right now to authorize a temporary release of funds. She actually had the nerve to suggest I could just write off the $75,000 catering bill as a business tax deduction. She ended the first voicemail by telling me to stop being so deeply selfish on my brother's special day. I deleted the message. I pressed play on the second voicemail. The tone had shifted drastically. The fake maternal patience was gone, replaced by raw, venomous rage. The background noise indicated she was walking outside, likely pacing the valet driveway of the St. Regis. She screamed into the receiver, her voice cracking with fury. She demanded to know who I thought I was to humiliate our family in front of Atlanta high society. She said I had single-handedly destroyed decades of careful social networking in a matter of minutes. Then came the twisted, toxic logic she had used to control me for my entire adult life. Her voice dropped into a vicious sneer. She reminded me of the family bankruptcy 10 years ago. She painted a picture of herself as a long-suffering martyr who had endured public shame when my father lost his corporate executive job. She yelled that I owed them my financial support because they had raised me. She explicitly stated that my money was the only useful thing about me. She screamed that spending my 20s building a logistics company instead of finding a prestigious husband was a total embarrassment. She said Harrison deserved the $2.5 million mansion because he was a man trying to build a respectable family while I was just a bitter spinster hoarding wealth I had no real use for. I leaned against the cool marble counter listening to the absolute delusion pouring from the speaker. For a decade, I had paid their country club dues, covered their luxury car leases, and financed every single one of Harrison's doomed startup ideas. I did it because I believed that was what a good daughter should do after her parents lost everything. But listening to her venomous rant, the absolute truth became undeniably clear. In Beatrice's eyes, my financial rescue mission was never viewed as a monumental sacrifice. It was simply viewed as my mandatory compensation for failing to secure a wealthy husband who could elevate their social status. I deleted the second voicemail. I did not need to listen to the other 12. Suddenly, the internal intercom system mounted on my wall chimed sharply. I walked over and pressed the flashing button. It was the night concierge working the security desk in the ground floor lobby of my building. His voice was laced with profound discomfort. He apologized for disturbing me at this hour. He informed me that a woman claiming to be my mother had bypassed the outer gate by tailgating a resident's vehicle into the parking garage. She was currently standing in the main lobby, demanding immediate access to the private penthouse elevator. The concierge noted that she was becoming extremely agitated and was disturbing the other residents. I activated the lobby camera feed on the intercom screen. There she was. Beatrice was pacing furiously in front of the polished mahogany security desk. Her expensive designer gown was wrinkled, and her meticulously sprayed hair was beginning to fall flat from the Georgia humidity. She was gesturing wildly at the concierge, pointing her finger and demanding compliance. I pressed the two-way audio button. I told the concierge I was viewing the feed and instructed him to put me on the lobby speaker system. My voice resonated through the ground floor lobby, clear and commanding. I told Beatrice to stop harassing the building staff. My mother froze her head, snapping up toward the ceiling speakers. She immediately launched into her theatrical performance. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, playing the role of a deeply concerned, victimized parent. She cried out to the empty lobby, loudly declaring that her daughter was having a mental breakdown. She told the concierge and anyone else within earshot that I was unstable, that the stress of running a tech company had ruined my mind, and that she just needed to get upstairs to get me some psychiatric help. She was actively trying to build a narrative of my incompetence right there in the lobby. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute chilling authority. I told my mother that her performance was completely wasted here. I reminded her that the St. Regis event director had already cut off the liquor, and the wealthy guests she so desperately wanted to impress had already gone home in disgust. I explicitly stated over the speaker system that the federal authorities would be reviewing the forged commercial mortgage documents on Monday morning. I advised her to stop worrying about my mental health and start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney who specialized in aggravated identity theft. Beatrice's fake tears vanished instantly. Her face contorted with genuine rage. She screamed at the security camera pointing directly at the lens. She shouted that I was an ungrateful wretch who would die alone because my money could never buy me a real family. She cursed the day I ever started my company, blaming my financial independence for tearing the family apart. She demanded I come downstairs and face her like a respectful daughter. I leaned closer to the intercom microphone. I told her the woman she could manipulate and guilt-trip died the moment I saw my forged signature on those bank documents. I informed her that I no longer had a mother and she no longer had a walking bank account. I then addressed the concierge directly. I instructed him to issue a formal trespass warning against the woman standing at his desk. I told him that if she did not vacate the premises in exactly 30 seconds, he was to dial 911 and have her arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace. I took my finger off the audio button and watched the silent feed on the screen. The concierge picked up his phone, his posture rigid and professional, as he warned her to leave. Beatrice stared at the camera one last time, her chest heaving with exertion. She looked around the pristine modern lobby, realizing that her high society intimidation tactics held absolutely no power here. She snatched her designer purse off the desk, spun on her heels, and marched toward the sliding glass exit doors. I watched her silhouette disappear into the dark Atlanta night. I turned off the screen, leaving the penthouse in complete serene silence. I walked back to the kitchen, poured the rest of my sparkling water down the sink, and went to bed knowing the real war would begin at sunrise. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. I had slept for exactly 4 hours, but my mind was incredibly sharp. The digital clock on my nightstand read 7 o'clock in the morning. Today was Sunday. The banks were closed, but the machinery of my retaliation was already moving at full speed. I walked into the kitchen, brewed a strong cup of black coffee, and opened my laptop to review the finalized legal affidavits David had emailed over during the night. Before I could even read the first paragraph, the lobby intercom chimed. I pressed the audio button, fully expecting Beatrice to have returned for round 2 of her unhinged theatrics. Instead, the morning concierge spoke in a hushed, highly respectful tone. He informed me that Dr. Winston Hayes and Judge Patricia Hayes were waiting in the lobby. Jasmine's parents had arrived. They were requesting an immediate audience with me. The concierge noted they were accompanied by a man holding a thick leather briefcase, presumably their own legal counsel. I took a sip of my coffee. The pressure from the in-laws had officially arrived at my doorstep. They were Atlanta royalty individuals, accustomed to dictating the terms of every situation they walked into. I told the concierge to send them up. I did not change out of my silk lounge clothes. I had nothing to prove to these people, and this was my territory. The private elevator chimed and the heavy metal doors slid open. Winston and Patricia stepped into my foyer. The sheer elegance they had displayed at the St. Regis the night before had been replaced by a cold, calculating intensity. Their lawyer stood silently behind them. I gestured toward the formal sitting area overlooking the skyline. I offered them coffee, which they sharply declined. They sat together on the pristine white sofa, presenting a united, formidable front. Patricia spoke first. She did not bother with pleasantries. She stated that the scene I caused at the wedding reception was a catastrophic embarrassment to their family name. She explained that the Hayes family had spent decades building an impeccable reputation in the Cascade community, and they would not allow a petty family dispute to drag their daughter into a public scandal. She looked at me with the absolute authority of a former judge and demanded that I withdraw my accusations against Harrison immediately. I stood perfectly still, resting my hands on the back of a leather armchair. I simply smiled and nodded, allowing her to reveal her entire hand before I spoke. Winston took my silence as submission. He leaned forward, adopting a tone of patriarchal reason. He told me that Harrison was a foolish young man who made a severe miscalculation, but sending him to federal prison would permanently ruin Jasmine's life. He opened his lawyer's briefcase and pulled out a certified cashier's check. Winston placed the check on my table. He declared it was written for $2.5 million. He offered to buy the Buckhead mansion outright, paying off the fraudulent commercial mortgage before the bank opened on Monday. In exchange, he presented a strict non-disclosure agreement. He demanded that I sign the document swearing never to speak of the identity theft again and sweep my mother and brother's felony under the rug. They were trying to buy my silence to protect their pristine social standing. I looked at the check sitting on the table. It was a staggering amount of money casually tossed like pocket change. I looked back up at Jasmine's parents. My smile never wavered. I politely informed them that they were completely misunderstanding the gravity of the situation. I explained that this was not a simple misunderstanding over a borrowed credit card. Harrison and Beatrice had stolen my corporate tax identification number. They had leveraged the livelihoods of 50 hardworking employees who depended on my company to feed their own families. Patricia's eyes narrowed dangerously. She warned me not to be arrogant. She threatened to use her extensive political connections across Georgia to make sure my logistics firm lost its upcoming municipal contracts. She claimed she could make my business operations exceedingly difficult if I chose to be uncooperative. She insisted that family matters must be resolved with financial settlements, not federal indictments. I continued to smile politely. I picked up the non-disclosure agreement, tore it down the middle, and let the pieces flutter onto the check. I told Patricia her political connections would be entirely useless against the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I informed them that my attorney David had already submitted the digital evidence file to the federal authorities. The timeline was established, the police report for identity theft was filed last night, and the process could not be stopped, not even for $2.5 million. Winston's face flushed with anger. He accused me of trying to destroy his innocent daughter out of sheer spite. That was the opening I had been waiting for. I walked over to my kitchen island, picked up my phone, and played the audio recording of the conversation I had with Jasmine in the bridal suite. The recording echoed clearly through the penthouse. Jasmine's voice filled the room, arrogantly declaring that because I was single, providing luxury for her, and Harrison was my duty. The recording proved undeniably that Jasmine knew exactly where the money was coming from. She was not a naive victim of Harrison's deception. She was an active participant in the financial abuse. The color drained completely from Winston and Patricia's faces. They stared at the torn paper on the table, the harsh reality sinking in. I advised them to take their millions and spend it on a divorce attorney for their daughter because Harrison was going to prison, and anyone attached to his assets would be dragged down with him. I pointed toward the elevator and told them our meeting was over. Winston and Patricia did not utter a single word in response. They simply turned around their posture, rigid with defeat, and stepped into the private elevator. The heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing them away from my sanctuary. I stood in the quiet of my penthouse, feeling the subtle vibration of the elevator descending. The sheer satisfaction of watching their aristocratic entitlement shatter against hard evidence was intoxicating. They had walked in believing they could purchase my silence with a check, but they left knowing their daughter was legally tethered to a sinking ship. I walked back to the kitchen island and picked up the torn pieces of the non-disclosure agreement. I tossed them into the trash bin, keeping the voided cashier's check as a souvenir of their desperation. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop. It was David. I answered immediately, anticipating the next phase of our retaliation. David sounded energized, his voice carrying the sharp cadence of a man who loved dismantling corporate fraud. He informed me that the automated security protocols we initiated last night were already catching flies in the web. David explained that because Harrison and Jasmine had planned to leave for their luxury honeymoon on Sunday afternoon, my brother was currently attempting to use his deactivated secondary credit cards. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure banking portal David had set up. A cascading list of red decline transaction alerts populated the screen in real time. It was a digital manifestation of Harrison's evaporating lifestyle. I watched as a charge for $12,000 at the Delta One first-class terminal was instantly rejected. Harrison was trying to pay for his international flights to the Maldives. 30 seconds later, a second charge for the exact same amount was declined on a different card. I could perfectly picture the scene unfolding at the Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Harrison dressed in his designer travel clothes, standing at the exclusive check-in counter, sweating profusely as the ticketing agent repeatedly handed back his useless plastic. David chuckled over the phone. He told me that Harrison was likely causing a massive scene demanding the airline staff run the cards again, completely unaware that his financial oxygen supply was permanently severed. But the declined flights were only the beginning of the cascade. David instructed me to refresh the corporate portal. A new red alert flashed on the screen. Harrison had attempted to access the online dashboard for my logistics firm. He had tried to initiate a massive wire transfer, attempting to move $50,000 from my company's operating account directly into his personal checking account. I felt a surge of cold fury. Even after the public humiliation at the St. Regis, even after Jasmine's parents had undoubtedly called to scream at him, Harrison was still trying to steal from me. He believed he could siphon cash to fund his escape before the federal authorities intervened. He was absolutely wrong. I told David to permanently lock the IP address Harrison was using and forward the attempted wire transfer logs directly to the FBI Cybercrimes Division. Every desperate move my brother made was just adding another concrete charge to his federal indictment. The financial dominoes continued to fall with relentless precision. My phone vibrated with a new notification. This time, it was an alert from the platinum card Beatrice had held for over a decade. She was attempting to process a retainer fee of $25,000 at a highly prestigious criminal defense law firm in downtown Atlanta. The transaction was instantly denied. I smiled at the screen. Beatrice was finally realizing the gravity of her situation. She was desperately trying to secure top-tier legal representation to defend herself against the impending notary fraud charges. But without my money, she could not even afford the initial consultation. She was completely financially paralyzed. David then delivered the most devastating piece of news. He explained that because I had filed the police report for identity theft late Saturday night, the National Bank's automated risk management algorithms had been triggered. The bank had flagged the commercial guarantee Harrison submitted for the Buckhead mansion. David informed me that the escrow account holding the funds for the $2.5 million property had been officially frozen by the bank's fraud department. The massive wire transfer scheduled to clear to the sellers on Monday morning was permanently canceled. The sale of the mansion was dead. Harrison did not own a luxury estate. He owned nothing but a mountain of federal charges. I asked David what would happen to Harrison now that he was stranded at the airport, with no flights, no money, and no house. David explained that the situation was entirely out of our hands and firmly in the jurisdiction of law enforcement. However, he noted that Jasmine's parents had likely intercepted their daughter by now. Given the audio recording I had played for them, Winston and Patricia would absolutely force Jasmine to cut her losses and abandon Harrison to save their own family reputation. As if on cue, my phone received a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief and dripping with venom. It simply read that I was a heartless monster and that I would pay for destroying their lives. The text came from Jasmine. She had clearly been pulled away from the airport by her parents, leaving Harrison entirely alone at the ticketing counter with his declined credit cards and his shattered illusions of wealth. I did not reply. I blocked the number immediately. I walked over to the expansive windows of my penthouse, looking out over the sprawling city of Atlanta. The afternoon sun bathed the skyscrapers in a warm golden light. For the first time in 10 years, I felt a profound sense of lightness. I was no longer carrying the crushing weight of my family's financial demands. I was no longer the designated survivor shielding them from the consequences of their own incompetence. The financial umbilical cord had been severed with absolute finality. Every single luxury they had enjoyed for the past decade had been funded by my late nights, my stress, and my relentless dedication to building a successful software company. They had taken my generosity for granted, viewing it as an endless resource to be exploited rather than a gift to be respected. They had crossed the ultimate line by trying to steal my identity and mortgage my life's work. Now they were experiencing the brutal reality of living without my protection. I took a deep breath, inhaling the quiet serenity of my secure, perfectly controlled environment. Tomorrow morning, the federal investigators would arrive at the corporate offices of the National Bank. The authorities would issue the formal arrest warrants for mortgage fraud and aggravated identity theft. Beatrice and Harrison would be taken into federal custody, stripped of their designer clothes and their country club pretenses. They would face the full, unyielding weight of the American justice system, and I would be sitting right here drinking my coffee, completely untouchable. I took another sip of my coffee, savoring the dark roast in the profound quiet of my penthouse. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the Atlanta skyline, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floor. My phone, which had remained mercifully silent since I blocked the number belonging to Jasmine, vibrated sharply against the marble kitchen island. The caller ID displayed the name of my company's head of cybersecurity, Victor. I had instructed him to monitor all physical and digital access points to our corporate headquarters throughout the weekend. I swiped to answer, expecting a routine status update regarding our server firewalls. Instead, Victor spoke with urgent clinical precision. He informed me that multiple unauthorized entry attempts were currently triggering the perimeter alarms at our main office building downtown. Someone was actively trying to breach the executive suite. I set my coffee mug down, the ceramic clinking loudly against the stone counter. I asked Victor to clarify how anyone could bypass the exterior doors on a Sunday afternoon when the building was entirely locked down. He explained that a former emergency access keycard issued to my mother years ago and supposedly deactivated had been swiped at the loading dock entrance. The security system denied the card, but the physical camera feed showed two individuals tailgating a maintenance worker inside before the heavy steel doors could close. I immediately opened my laptop and connected to the encrypted corporate security network. The high-definition camera feeds populated my screen in a neat grid displaying the empty modern corridors of my logistics firm. I clicked through the various camera angles until I spotted frantic movement on the 5th floor. There they were. Harrison and Beatrice were marching down the executive hallway. Harrison was still wearing the wrinkled trousers and untucked dress shirt from his failed airport escape. Beatrice looked completely disheveled, her expensive designer dress stained, and her meticulously styled hair in absolute disarray. They looked like cornered scavengers hunting for a way out. I watched in cold fascination as Harrison approached the heavy glass door of my personal office. He aggressively yanked the handle, but the biometric lock held firm. Beatrice shoved him aside and began frantically digging through her oversized purse. She pulled out a heavy metal paperweight she must have grabbed from a receptionist's desk downstairs. She began hammering the metal object against the reinforced glass, her face contorted in a mask of sheer panic and feral desperation. They were completely unhinged. They knew the federal investigators would seize the corporate servers on Monday morning, so they had come to physically destroy the forged documents and wipe the digital hard drives to save themselves. This was it. This was the absolute last straw for me. They were no longer just trying to save their own skin by fleeing the state. They were actively attempting to sabotage my business operations and destroy physical company property. I tapped my laptop keyboard to activate the two-way audio communication system wired throughout the executive floor. I leaned closer to the built-in microphone. I spoke with a booming metallic authority that echoed through the empty corporate hallway. I told them to step away from the glass immediately. Harrison jumped back, dropping his hands to his sides as if he had been burned. Beatrice froze, the heavy metal paperweight slipping from her grip and crashing onto the carpeted floor. They stared wildly at the ceiling speakers, searching frantically for the source of my voice. I informed them that they were currently being recorded in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. I explained that attempting to destroy corporate servers to conceal mortgage fraud was a separate federal charge called spoliation of evidence. Harrison fell to his knees right there in the hallway. He clutched his head and began sobbing uncontrollably, begging the ceiling speaker for mercy. He cried out that his new wife had served him with annulment papers at the airport and that he had absolutely nothing left to his name. He pleaded with me to unlock the office doors so he could just erase the fraudulent files and make the entire nightmare go away. Beatrice did not beg for forgiveness. Her desperation violently mutated back into the toxic entitlement that had defined her entire existence. She screamed up at the camera lens, her voice cracking with pure venom. She shouted that I owed them this company because they were my blood. She demanded that I open the server room and take the fall for the forged documents myself. She reasoned that I was strong enough to survive a massive financial hit, while her precious Harrison was entirely too fragile to endure a lengthy federal prison sentence. She actually commanded me to sacrifice my own personal freedom just to shield her golden child from the devastating consequences of his own criminal actions. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. I simply pressed a bright red command button on my digital dashboard that initiated the commercial building emergency lockdown protocol. Heavy steel security shutters immediately slammed down over the elevator banks and the stairwell exits, effectively trapping them inside the fifth-floor corridor with no possible avenue for escape. I calmly told my mother that her golden child was about to learn exactly how the real world operates when you break the law. I ended the audio transmission and picked up my cell phone to dial the proper authorities. I did not wait for the federal agents to arrive on Monday morning. I reported an active break-in and corporate espionage in progress directly to the local police department dispatch. I sat back in my comfortable chair, took another long sip of my black coffee, and watched the live high-definition security feed. The flashing lights illuminated the street below as the distant, piercing wail of police sirens began to echo loudly through the downtown streets, now sealing their ultimate fate. I watched the red and blue emergency lights strobe across the glass exterior of my corporate headquarters through the high-definition security feed. The sheer magnitude of what was happening settled over me not as a heavy burden, but as a profound and exhilarating liberation. I realized in that moment that I did not want to watch this historic turning point through a digital screen from the sterile safety of my penthouse. I wanted to look them directly in the eyes as the devastating consequences of their own actions finally caught up to them. I set my empty coffee mug on the marble counter, grabbed my car keys, and headed straight for the private elevator. The drive from my midtown residence to the downtown business district took less than 10 minutes. The streets were relatively quiet for a Sunday evening, allowing me to navigate the urban landscape with focused, predatory precision. As I turned the corner onto the main commercial avenue leading to my building, the chaotic scene illuminated the dark night. 4 police cruisers were parked haphazardly across the front pedestrian plaza. A local news van, likely tipped off by the police scanner chatter regarding a high-profile corporate break-in at a major tech firm, was already parked near the loading dock with its broadcast antenna fully extended. I pulled my vehicle into the secure underground parking level and took the private executive elevator directly to the ground floor lobby. The heavy steel security shutters I had activated earlier were now locked in their open positions, allowing the local authorities full access to the premises. I stepped out into the expansive, brightly lit main lobby of my logistics firm. The space was constructed of imported Italian marble and reinforced architectural glass designed to project absolute corporate authority. Right in the center of the lobby, surrounded by 4 uniformed police officers, stood Beatrice and Harrison. They had been escorted down from the 5th-floor executive suite. Instead of remaining silent and exercising her legal rights, my mother was putting on the theatrical performance of a lifetime. A local news reporter and her cameraman had managed to step just inside the revolving glass doors, capturing the entire spectacular meltdown. Beatrice was weeping aggressively, clutching a lace handkerchief to her chest. She was pleading with the lead police officer, desperately spinning a fabricated narrative to save her golden child from a federal prison sentence. I stood quietly near the elevator banks, temporarily obscured by a large decorative indoor palm, and listened to the absolute delusion pouring from my mother's mouth. She was crying out that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. She claimed that I was a mentally unstable, vindictive daughter who was trying to frame my own family out of petty jealousy and corporate greed. Beatrice gestured dramatically toward Harrison, describing him as a brilliant entrepreneur who was simply trying to retrieve his own personal business documents from a shared family enterprise. She lied effortlessly, telling the officers and the recording news camera that I had locked them in the corridor during a manic episode to maliciously extort money from them. Harrison stood slightly behind her, nodding vigorously, playing the role of the innocent, victimized brother. He looked absolutely pathetic, his expensive designer tuxedo shirt completely soaked in nervous sweat. Beatrice then turned her attention directly to the news reporter, sensing an opportunity to manipulate public perception before the federal charges could stick to their names. She stepped toward the heavy camera lens, her voice dripping with fake maternal sorrow, lamenting how incredibly hard it was to love a daughter who had lost her grip on reality and turned against her own blood. I stepped out from behind the decorative foliage. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished marble floor cut through the lobby like a metronome ticking down to their destruction. The police officers noticed me first, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts, until the building night security guard quickly identified me as the sole owner and chief executive officer of the corporation. The officers relaxed their defensive posture, but the crowd of onlookers, building staff, and the news crew instantly focused their absolute attention on me. Beatrice froze mid-sentence. The fake tears glistening on her cheeks seemed to evaporate into the air. Harrison physically shrank back, trying to hide his tall frame behind my mother's shoulders. I walked with deliberate, unhurried steps straight across the lobby. I did not look at the police officers. I did not look at my trembling brother. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Beatrice. Her eyes widened in genuine, unadulterated terror as I approached. The local news reporter stood just a few feet away from my mother, holding a heavy, foam-covered microphone, eagerly toward her, hungry for the dramatic family scoop. I walked directly up to the reporter. I offered a polite, commanding smile and smoothly reached out my hand. Before the reporter could even process the swift movement, I gripped the microphone and pulled it firmly from her grasp. I turned to face the camera, the police officers, and my terrified family. The entire lobby fell dead silent. You could hear the distant, quiet hum of the central air conditioning system echoing through the vast space. I held the microphone, comfortably testing its weight in my palm, and took a deep, steadying breath. It was time to permanently dismantle the illusion they had spent decades building. "Good evening," I said into the microphone, my voice projecting clearly across the marble lobby and directly into the live news camera. "My mother just told you that I am unstable and vindictive. She claims this is a simple family business misunderstanding, but I have something my mother and my brother completely lack. I have absolute integrity and a corporate bank account that was not built on federal fraud and stolen identity." I looked directly at Harrison, who was now trembling visibly under the fluorescent lights. I continued my broadcast, ensuring every single person in the room understood the exact magnitude of the situation. The man standing behind my mother did not come here to retrieve personal documents. He came here to illegally destroy corporate servers because he was caught committing aggravated identity theft. He forged my signature and used my company assets as collateral to secure a $2.5 million commercial mortgage for a luxury mansion he could never afford. I turned my gaze back to Beatrice, watching her carefully constructed high society facade shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "And the woman crying fake tears for these cameras," I announced into the microphone, "used her official state notary stamp to authenticate those forged documents. They broke into this building tonight to erase the digital trail of their federal crimes because they know the Federal Bureau of Investigation will be serving them with indictments on Monday morning." I held the microphone out, letting the devastating truth settle over the silent lobby. The lead police officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, signaling the absolute end of the line. I handed the microphone back to the stunned reporter, turned on my heel, and walked toward the exit. Before I could even push through the revolving glass doors leading out to the plaza, I stopped. Leaving them to be handcuffed in the center of the lobby was profoundly satisfying, but it was not entirely complete. They had spent decades weaving an intricate web of lies to protect their social standing. I needed to ensure that every single thread of that web was publicly and undeniably severed. I turned back around to face the chaotic scene unfolding in my corporate headquarters. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single pre-drafted text message to David. The message contained a simple command to execute the protocol override on the building's central media system. My logistics firm featured a massive 3-story digital display wall spanning the entire back structure of the main lobby. It was typically used to showcase our global supply chain analytics and corporate branding to visiting investors. Tonight, it was going to serve a much different purpose. The ambient corporate branding suddenly faded to pitch black. A second later, the gigantic screens illuminated the entire marble lobby with a blinding white light. I had instructed David to project the high-resolution scans of the forged commercial guarantee directly onto the massive digital billboard. The fraudulent bank documents were magnified to 50 times their original size. Every single detail was completely inescapable. I walked back towards the local news camera, which immediately pivoted away from the arresting officers to follow the staggering glow of the giant screen. I pointed up at the undeniable evidence hanging over my family like a digital guillotine. I told the reporter to make sure her cameraman got a very tight zoom on the signature line. I narrated the evidence for the live broadcast, keeping my voice steady and authoritative. I pointed out the exact date and timestamp of the mortgage approval, highlighting how it perfectly aligned with the preparations for the extravagant wedding. I highlighted the Buckhead Mansion address, proving exactly where the stolen money was supposed to go. Then, I directed everyone's absolute attention to the bottom right corner of the 50-foot display. There, perfectly visible for the entire city of Atlanta to see, was Beatrice's official state notary seal. It permanently linked her to the felony of aggravated identity theft. Beatrice shrieked, covering her face with her trembling hands, as if the bright light of the screen was physically burning her skin. Harrison fell completely silent, his previous protest dying in his throat. The lead police officer pulled out his shoulder radio, calling for a white-collar crime detective to report to the scene immediately. He clearly recognized that this was no longer just a simple corporate break-in. It was the unearthing of a massive federal conspiracy. Then the display shifted again. David pushed the next piece of digital evidence live. The giant screen switched from the bank documents to the crisp, high-definition security footage from the fifth-floor executive corridor. The video showed Harrison aggressively yanking on my biometric office door handle. It then cut to the clear angle of Beatrice violently hammering the reinforced glass with the heavy metal paperweight, the visual proof of their absolute desperation and their willingness to destroy corporate property played on a relentless loop above them. The news reporter gasped her microphone, catching the sharp sound of the metal hitting the glass from the lobby audio playback. I looked at my mother, who was now being read her Miranda rights by a stern-faced female officer. I told Beatrice that her carefully curated high society friends were likely watching this exact live feed from their luxury homes in Cascade and Buckhead. I told her that the wealthy country club ladies she had spent decades trying to impress were currently pouring fresh glasses of wine to watch her get loaded into the back of a police cruiser. Her reputation, the only thing she truly valued in this world, was officially incinerated on live television. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was a text message from Winston Hayes, the cardiovascular surgeon and Jasmine's father. I opened the message and read it aloud for the camera, ensuring the microphone picked up every word. The message stated that the marriage annulment paperwork had been formally submitted less than an hour ago. Winston explicitly wrote that the Hayes family was fully cooperating with federal authorities to distance themselves completely from Harrison's fraudulent mortgage scheme. The last remaining pillar of their grand delusion had officially collapsed. Harrison was not going to be saved by his wealthy new in-laws. He was entirely on his own. Harrison dropped his head, sobbing loudly, as the police officer secured the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He begged me to tell them to stop crying out that he would do anything to fix this. I stared at him without a single ounce of pity. I reminded him that I had spent the last 10 years fixing his mistakes and funding his failures. I told him that federal prison would be the very first venture he would have to navigate without my checkbook. I turned to the lead police officer and provided my business card. I stated that my legal team would deliver the raw data files and the complete physical evidence binder for their investigation by tomorrow morning. I thanked the officers for their swift and professional response. Then, without sparing another glance at my weeping mother or my handcuffed brother, I finally walked out through the revolving glass doors. The cool night air hit my face, bringing an overwhelming sense of profound relief. I walked toward my car, knowing I was finally free. I slid into the driver's seat of my vehicle, the heavy leather door sealing me inside a quiet sanctuary away from the flashing sirens and the chaos I had orchestrated. I started the engine, letting the quiet purr of the motor ground me in my new reality. Driving back to my penthouse, the streets of Atlanta felt entirely different. For a decade, I had driven these exact roads, carrying the crushing weight of my family's financial expectations on my shoulders. I was always rushing to cover a bounced check, always negotiating a settlement for one of Harrison's failed ventures, always apologizing to vendors on my mother's behalf. Tonight, the passenger seat was empty, and the suffocating burden was permanently gone. I parked in my secure garage and took the elevator up to my residence. I did not sleep a single wink that night. Instead, I stood by my floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city transition from deep velvet night to the crisp, bright blue of a Monday morning. Today was the day the financial guillotine would officially drop. Cutting off their credit cards at the St. Regis was merely a temporary tourniquet. Today, I was surgically severing the central artery. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, I walked through the towering glass doors of the National Bank's regional headquarters in downtown Atlanta. David matched my pace, carrying a thick locked titanium briefcase containing the raw data files, the forged commercial guarantee, and the police reports from last night's corporate break-in. We did not stop at the reception desk. We bypassed the teller lines and took the executive elevator directly to the top floor, where the senior vice president of commercial lending and the head of their internal fraud division were waiting for us in a frosted glass conference room. When we entered, the executives were already sweating. They had undoubtedly seen the viral local news broadcast from last night. They knew they had approved a $2.5 million mortgage based on catastrophically forged documents, and they knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation was currently knocking on their doors. I did not offer a handshake. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, folded my hands, and told them exactly how the morning was going to proceed. I informed the senior vice president that my company was immediately withdrawing all of our corporate operating accounts from their institution. The banking executives panicked frantically, apologizing and promising to rectify the situation without negative publicity. They tried to assure me that the Buckhead Mansion escrow account had already been completely frozen. I looked the vice president dead in the eye and told him freezing the account was not enough. I demanded a legally binding document signed by the bank's chief legal counsel right then and there. The document had to explicitly state that my logistics firm bore absolute zero financial liability for the forged commercial guarantee, and that the bank fully acknowledged the transaction was the result of criminal identity theft perpetrated by Harrison and Beatrice. The bank executives scrambled to comply. They brought in their legal team, rushing to draft the release of liability. While they typed furiously, David slid another thick folder across the mahogany table. It contained a comprehensive forensic audit of Harrison's previous business failures. David informed the bank's fraud department that Harrison had not just forged my signature for the house. He had routinely inflated his personal income on previous commercial loan applications by falsely claiming phantom dividends from my company. David calmly noted that we had already forwarded this financial audit to the Internal Revenue Service. Harrison was not just facing bank fraud and identity theft charges from federal agents. He was about to be audited by the IRS for severe tax evasion. The bank executives stared at the paperwork in absolute horror. By signing off on the $2.5 million mortgage without verifying my signature, their bank was now caught in the crosshairs of a massive federal tax investigation. I watched the head of the fraud division physically sink into his leather chair. I had effectively weaponized their own bureaucratic negligence against my brother. Within 45 minutes, the absolute release of liability was signed, stamped and secured in David's titanium briefcase. The $2.5 million transaction was permanently reversed. The Buckhead Mansion, the ultimate symbol of Jasmine and Harrison's shallow greed, officially went back onto the foreclosure market. Their financial lifeline was completely and permanently severed. I walked out of the bank headquarters feeling invincible. My corporate assets were secured, and the perpetrators were sitting in holding cells at the county jail, waiting for their federal arraignment. As David and I celebrated over a quiet lunch at a nearby upscale cafe, my cell phone vibrated. The screen displayed an incoming collect call from the Fulton County Jail. It was Beatrice. I looked at David, who simply nodded his encouragement. I accepted the automated charges and pressed the phone to my ear, putting it on speaker so David could hear every word. Beatrice's voice came through the receiver, sounding thin, raspy, and stripped of all her usual high society arrogance. She was weeping, her breath hitching as she spoke over the recorded jail line. She begged me to post her bail. She cried that the holding cell was freezing cold, that she had not slept on the metal bench, and that Harrison was terrified in the men's holding block. She actually tried to use the word family again, pleading with me to remember the time she took care of me when I was a child. She asked me to unlock just one of her frozen credit cards, long enough to secure a local bail bondsman. I listened to her desperate pleas, letting her exhaust every ounce of her manipulative energy. When she finally paused to catch her breath, waiting for me to cave, I spoke with absolute unwavering finality. I told her that she lost the right to my protection the moment she picked up her notary stamp to steal my company. I reminded her that she had spent my entire life calling me a disappointment, and that today I was finally living up to her expectations. I informed her that she would not see a single cent from me, not for bail, not for a defense lawyer, and not for commissary snacks. I told her to enjoy the cold reality of the consequences she built for herself. I did not wait for her to scream or beg further. I ended the call permanently, blocking the county jail's automated number from my phone. I picked up my fork, smiled across the table at David, and enjoyed the rest of my lunch in perfect, uninterrupted peace. The pristine silence of our celebratory lunch was finally broken when David's secure work phone vibrated against the white linen tablecloth. We had just finished our espresso, basking in the flawless execution of our morning at the bank. David picked up the device, his eyes rapidly scanning a lengthy encrypted message from his close colleague in the legal defense circuit. A slow, deeply satisfied grin spread across his face. He looked up at me and announced that the absolute destruction of my brother was even more spectacular than we had witnessed on the security cameras. What happened behind the closed doors of the Hayes family estate in Cascade was a masterclass in brutal high society excommunication. David leaned forward, intertwining his fingers, and relayed the exact details of Harrison's swift and merciless downfall. When Winston and Patricia Hayes fled my penthouse on Sunday morning, after I tore up their non-disclosure agreement, they did not just drive home in defeat. They returned to their sprawling gated estate with a singular, ruthless objective. They were going to surgically excise Harrison from their family tree before his impending federal indictment could splatter mud onto their generational legacy. According to David's legal source, Winston had immediately summoned Harrison to the Cascade estate. Harrison arrived at their wrought iron gates in a state of absolute panic, still wearing the wrinkled clothes from the ruined wedding reception. He genuinely believed that his wealthy new in-laws were going to bail him out. He walked into their grand marble foyer expecting a massive check and a team of corporate lawyers ready to fight his battles. Instead, he walked into an execution. Winston did not offer my brother a seat. He did not offer him a glass of water. He stood in the center of the foyer alongside Patricia and Jasmine. Harrison immediately launched into his pathetic, rehearsed excuses. He tried to blame the forged documents on a misunderstanding with the real estate broker. He attempted to throw Beatrice under the bus, claiming my mother had handled the notary paperwork without his direct knowledge. He begged Winston for the $2.5 million, promising he would pay them back the moment his non-existent tech ventures finally took off. Winston Hayes, a man who had spent 40 years building an unassailable reputation as a top-tier cardiovascular surgeon, did not yell. He did not argue. He simply stepped forward and delivered a sharp, echoing slap directly across Harrison's face. The physical strike snapped Harrison's head to the side, completely shattering his arrogant illusion. Winston pointed a rigid finger at the heavy mahogany front doors and told my brother he was a parasite who had attempted to infect their family. He ordered Harrison to empty his pockets right there in the foyer. Harrison was forced to hand over the keys to the luxury sports car the Hayes family had leased for him as a wedding gift. He had to take off the $30,000 platinum watch Winston had purchased for him just last month. He was stripped of every single status symbol he had acquired through their brief association. He was left standing there with absolutely nothing but the lint in his pockets and the overwhelming terror of his incoming federal charges. But the most devastating blow did not come from Winston. It came from Jasmine. David explained that Jasmine had watched her father strip Harrison of his dignity, and her reaction was not one of spousal solidarity. She did not shed a single tear for her new husband. Jasmine was a woman who valued social currency above human connection, and she recognized instantly that Harrison's currency had entirely run out. She stepped forward, looked at the red mark fading on Harrison's cheek, and told him he was the most pathetic excuse for a man she had ever met. Jasmine screamed that he had ruined her entire social life. She yelled that her friends were already mocking her online, turning her extravagant wedding into a viral laughingstock. She did not care about the federal crimes or the threat of prison. She only cared that the Buckhead mansion was gone and her pristine reputation was collateral damage. She demanded that their private legal counsel draft the annulment paperwork immediately right there on the kitchen island. She forced Harrison to sign the documents while he was still trembling from her father's physical reprimand. Within 20 minutes of arriving at the estate, Harrison was thrown out of the front gates. He had to walk 2 miles down the affluent, tree-lined streets of Cascade just to find a major intersection where he could hail a rideshare. That was exactly what had triggered his desperate, doomed flight to the airport. He was running from the crushing reality that nobody was coming to save him. Not his rich in-laws, not his enabling mother, and certainly not the sister he had spent a decade treating like a disposable asset. I sat back in my chair absorbing every single word of David's recount. I felt a profound, chilling sense of validation. Beatrice and Harrison had spent their entire lives worshiping the elite social class. They had judged me, belittled me, and ultimately tried to ruin me just to secure their place among Atlanta's wealthiest families. And in the end, it was that exact same elite social class that chewed them up and spit them out onto the pavement. The Hayes family operated with the same ruthless self-preservation that Beatrice admired, but she had foolishly believed her fake pedigree would protect her. I signaled the waiter for the check. I pulled out my primary black card, the one that actually belonged to me, and paid for our celebratory lunch. I told David we needed to head back to my corporate headquarters. The local police had secured the building after last night's arrests, but the real authorities were about to arrive. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service had officially scheduled our joint debriefing for 2 o'clock this afternoon. We had to prepare the final digital evidence transfers that would permanently lock the prison cell doors behind my family. We walked out of the upscale cafe and stepped into the bright, warm Georgia sunlight. The air felt incredibly clean. The chaotic destruction of my family was completely sealed behind the heavy closed doors of holding cells and annulment papers. I had orchestrated a perfect, unstoppable sequence of consequences. Every lie they had told, every dollar they had stolen, and every insult they had hurled had finally boomeranged back to destroy them. I opened the door to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and drove toward the absolute undeniable victory waiting for me downtown. I pulled my car into the designated reserved spot beneath my corporate headquarters. The underground garage was quiet, save for the steady hum of the ventilation systems. David was already waiting by the private elevator, gripping the titanium briefcase that held the final nails for my family's coffin. We rode the elevator up to the executive suite in comfortable silence. The fifth-floor corridor still bore the faint scuff marks from my mother's frantic paperweight assault the night before, a physical reminder of their absolute desperation. We swiped our credentials and entered the main boardroom. The room was already occupied. 2 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation sat on one side of the massive glass table, dressed in immaculate dark suits. Next to them sat a senior forensic accountant representing the Internal Revenue Service. Their presence commanded the room, projecting the heavy, unyielding weight of the federal government. I introduced myself, shaking their hands with firm confidence. They were not here to intimidate me. They were here to dismantle the fraudulent empire my brother and mother had attempted to build on my back. The lead FBI agent, a sharp-eyed man named Agent Vance, initiated the meeting. He placed a thick file on the table and stated that the local police had formally transferred custody of Harrison and Beatrice early this morning. They were currently sitting in federal holding cells awaiting arraignment. Agent Vance explained that the preliminary evidence from the commercial bank was incredibly damaging, but they needed my direct testimony and the raw corporate data to solidify the indictment for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. I sat down directly across from the federal agents and nodded to David. My attorney placed the locked titanium briefcase on the glass table and popped the heavy latches. He withdrew the meticulously organized evidence binders and handed one to each investigator. I began my statement by clearly and unequivocally denying any knowledge or authorization of the $2.5 million commercial guarantee. I explained how Harrison had breached my corporate firewall, likely utilizing an old administrative password he had stolen years ago. I directed the agents to Section 2 of the binder. I walked them through the fabricated board meeting minutes. I pointed out the glaring discrepancies in the corporate letterhead and the forged digital signatures. Agent Vance scrutinized the documents, tracing the fake signature with his pen. He asked about the notary seal. I looked him dead in the eye and confirmed that Beatrice had exclusive access to that specific physical stamp. I explained that her deliberate authentication elevated this to a premeditated federal conspiracy. The FBI agents took meticulous notes, their expressions hardening as the sheer audacity of the crime became apparent. But the true fatal blow came when the IRS forensic accountant leaned forward. He had been quietly reviewing the extensive financial audit David prepared regarding Harrison's previous loan applications. The accountant adjusted his glasses and asked me to confirm the dividend payouts my company had allegedly issued to Harrison over the past 5 years. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. I informed the IRS investigator that my company had never issued a single dividend to Harrison. He had never owned a fraction of a percent of equity in my logistics firm. Every single tax document he had submitted to secure his previous luxury car leases and personal lines of credit was a complete fabrication. He had invented hundreds of thousands of dollars in phantom corporate income to maintain his high society facade. The IRS accountant shook his head in absolute disbelief. He stated that claiming fake corporate dividends on federal tax returns to secure bank loans constituted severe tax evasion and bank fraud. He calculated out loud that the back taxes, the compounding penalties, and the sheer volume of fraudulent applications would guarantee Harrison a mandatory federal prison sentence, regardless of the Buckhead Mansion scheme. My brother had been building a massive house of cards, and we had just handed the federal government the heavy industrial fan needed to blow it completely down. Agent Vance asked if I had experienced any coercion from the perpetrators since discovering the fraud. I pulled out my phone and accessed the secured digital vault where I saved the voicemail recordings. I placed the device in the center of the glass table and played the audio of my mother screaming at me from the lobby intercom. The federal agents listened in absolute silence as Beatrice violently demanded I take the fall for Harrison's crimes. They heard her explicitly admit to knowing about the forged documents. The recording was the final, inescapable trap. It proved premeditation, active participation, and a blatant attempt to obstruct justice. Agent Vance turned off the recording and looked at me with professional respect. He told me that in his 20 years investigating white-collar crime, he had rarely seen a family betray their blood with such calculated malice. He also noted that he had never seen a victim hand over such a flawlessly assembled prosecution package. The IRS investigator packed the financial audits back into his secure satchel. He informed me that they would be initiating immediate asset seizure protocols. Every single bank account associated with Harrison and Beatrice would be permanently frozen pending the criminal trial. The luxury vehicles they leased, the designer jewelry they flaunted, and the remaining funds in their personal checking accounts would be seized to pay off the massive federal tax penalties. They were going to be stripped down to the absolute studs. Agent Vance stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He officially confirmed that the grand jury indictments would be handed down by Tuesday morning. Harrison was facing up to 30 years in federal prison for the combined charges of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Beatrice was facing at least 15 years for notary fraud and conspiracy. Because the evidence was overwhelming and the flight risk high, the federal prosecutor was going to request they be denied bail. My flawlessly executed victory was now completely and unconditionally absolute forever. Tuesday morning arrived with the heavy, humid heat typical of late summer in Atlanta. David and I walked up the wide concrete steps of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building. The plaza was swarming with local news vans and aggressive reporters. Word had leaked late Sunday night that a major federal indictment involving mortgage fraud and identity theft was coming down on a prominent Buckhead family. We bypassed the media circus, passing through the heavy security checkpoints and taking the elevator up to the federal courtrooms. Today was the official arraignment, and I was not going to miss a single second of the spectacle. We took our seats in the second row of the gallery. The mahogany-paneled courtroom was freezing, the air conditioning blasting with absolute corporate sterility. Moments later, the heavy side doors opened, and the federal marshals escorted the defendants into the room. Harrison and Beatrice shuffled in their wrists and ankles, bound by heavy steel transport chains. The transformation was breathtaking. The custom-tailored tuxedos and designer silk gowns from the St. Regis wedding had been replaced by oversized faded orange jumpsuits. Beatrice's meticulously highlighted hair hung in greasy, unkempt strands around her pale, gaunt face. Harrison looked entirely hollowed out, trembling so violently that the chains around his wrists rattled against the defense table. They were not the only ones who showed up for the spectacle. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Winston and Patricia Hayes marched down the center aisle. They were flanked by a team of razor-sharp corporate litigators. Jasmine walked right between her parents, wearing a pristine white designer pantsuit and oversized black sunglasses. She looked completely untouched by the scandal, radiating the icy, calculating detachment of a woman who had already surgically removed the infected tissue from her life. The Hayes family did not sit in the gallery. They marched straight up to the wooden railing, dividing the spectator area from the defense tables. Harrison turned his head, his hollow eyes lighting up with a pathetic, desperate spark of hope. He genuinely thought his wealthy bride had come to pay his legal fees and rescue him from federal custody. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jasmine did not let him utter a single syllable. Jasmine removed her designer sunglasses and glared at the man she had married exactly 72 hours ago. Her high-powered attorney stepped forward and slapped a thick manila folder aggressively onto the defense table right in front of Harrison's chained hands. Jasmine leaned over the wooden railing, her voice dripping with absolute venomous contempt. She informed Harrison that she had filed for a legal annulment based on extreme criminal fraud. She loudly declared that he was a completely broke, pathetic con artist who had ruined her perfect wedding and humiliated her family in front of the entire Cascade social elite. She stated that he had 48 hours to sign the papers before her father's legal team buried him in civil lawsuits for emotional distress and reputational damage. Harrison stared at the annulment papers in absolute horror. The final desperate illusion that he could somehow charm his way out of this disaster completely evaporated. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving, as the reality of his total isolation set in. Beatrice, unable to comprehend that she had lost all her high society leverage, immediately went on the offensive. She lunged forward against her chains, glaring at Jasmine with pure, unadulterated venom. Beatrice hissed across the courtroom railing, attempting to use her outdated, haughty matriarch tone. She ordered Jasmine to show some respect. Beatrice claimed that the Hayes family was legally bound to support them through this trial because they had gleefully accepted the $2.5 million Buckhead mansion. She threatened to drag Winston and Patricia down with them, insisting she would tell the press that the Hayes family was complicit in the mortgage fraud. Jasmine let out a sharp, echoing laugh that cut through the sterile courtroom air. It was a cold, utterly merciless sound. She looked my mother up and down, taking in the greasy hair and the orange prison uniform. Jasmine told Beatrice she was nothing but a delusional, aging parasite who had spent her entire life leeching off her own daughter's hard work. Jasmine proudly announced that her father, Winston, had already spent Sunday evening fully cooperating with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Hayes family had proactively turned over every single text message, email, and voicemail Beatrice had ever sent them regarding the fraudulent mansion purchase. Jasmine smiled a predatory, flawless smile. She explicitly stated that her family had secured full federal immunity by handing the prosecutors the exact timeline of Beatrice's notary fraud. Jasmine leaned closer and whispered that the Hayes family was leaving them to rot in federal prison, and they would not spend a single penny to save a pair of broke, pathetic criminals. The alliance between the parasites completely shattered right there in the courtroom. Beatrice shrieked her face, turning a mottled, dangerous shade of purple. She lunged toward the wooden railing, her chains clanking loudly as the federal marshals immediately grabbed her shoulders to restrain her. But the true implosion came from Harrison. Realizing that his mother's arrogance had just destroyed his absolute last chance at a legal defense, my brother snapped. Harrison whipped around and screamed at Beatrice at the top of his lungs. He blamed her for everything. He yelled that he never would have forged the commercial guarantee if Beatrice had not constantly pressured him to secure a luxury mansion to impress his new in-laws. He screamed that she was the one who practically shoved her notary stamp onto the fraudulent documents, insisting that Clara would never find out until the ink was dry. Beatrice screamed back her maternal devotion, instantly vaporizing under the threat of a 15-year prison sentence. She threw Harrison right under the bus, shouting to the entire courtroom that he was a 35-year-old failure who could not hold down a job. She yelled that she only notarized the documents because he begged her, claiming it was his only chance to finally become a real man. The golden child and the enabling matriarch were violently tearing each other apart, viciously scrambling to save themselves by sacrificing the other. The heavy wooden door behind the judge's bench swung open. The bailiff yelled for the courtroom to rise. The federal judge took his seat, slamming his gavel down hard to instantly silence the screaming match between mother and son. The judge looked down at the defendants with absolute disgust, clearly having heard the chaotic exchange from his chambers. The arraignment proceeded with lightning speed. The federal prosecutor formally read the charges of aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, and tax evasion. When the topic of bail arose, the prosecutor pointed to the overwhelming flight risk, the severity of the financial crimes, and the active attempt to destroy corporate evidence on Sunday night. The judge did not hesitate. He denied bail entirely. He slammed his gavel down, officially remanding Beatrice and Harrison back to the federal detention center until their trial. The marshals grabbed their arms, hauling them toward the side exit. Harrison was sobbing uncontrollably, begging anyone to help him. Beatrice was hyperventilating, staring wildly at the ceiling as the reality of a decade behind bars finally crushed her. I sat next to David in the gallery, my posture perfectly relaxed. I watched the heavy steel doors close firmly behind them. The toxic bond that had tortured me for a decade was permanently severed, and they had ultimately destroyed each other. David and I walked out of the federal courthouse into the blinding Georgia sunlight. The media frenzy had already shifted its focus from the arraignment to the spectacular annulment filed by the Hayes family. My phone remained blissfully quiet, entirely purged of the relentless demands that had dictated my schedule for 10 long years. I instructed David to return to his office and begin drafting the final protective orders. I needed to get back to my corporate headquarters. My logistics firm had a global supply chain to manage, and I refused to let my family's criminal implosion disrupt my business operations for a single second longer. By Wednesday morning, the corporate atmosphere at my company had completely stabilized. The internal security breach had been thoroughly neutralized, and our client base had actually expanded. The prominent news coverage highlighting our impenetrable digital firewalls and my absolute refusal to compromise corporate integrity had attracted 3 new major commercial contracts. I was sitting at my executive desk, reviewing the final implementation phases for a new software deployment, when my office intercom chimed with an aggressive, continuous buzz. My head of building security spoke through the speaker, his voice tight with professional restraint. He informed me that my father, Richard, was currently standing in the ground floor lobby. The security chief noted that Richard was causing a massive public disturbance, loudly demanding immediate access to the executive suite. According to the report, Richard was aggressively waving legal documents in the air and threatening to sue the entire security staff if they did not let him upstairs to see his own flesh and blood. I leaned back in my leather chair and took a slow, deliberate breath. Richard had been conspicuously absent during the chaotic microphone drop at the wedding reception and the brutal federal arraignment. He was a man who preferred to let Beatrice fight the social battles while he quietly enjoyed the financial spoils of my labor. 10 years ago, when his own business ventures collapsed into bankruptcy, he had gladly stepped into the shadows, allowing Beatrice to groom Harrison as their new golden ticket, while reducing me to a silent, reliable automated teller machine. Now that his wife and his golden child were sitting in federal detention, Richard was finally forced to step into the light. I pressed the intercom button and instructed security to escort him up to the 5th-floor conference room. I wanted him out of the public lobby, and I wanted to deliver his final reality check in a controlled, highly secure environment. I walked down the glass corridor and entered the boardroom just as the elevator doors slid open. 2 burly security guards escorted Richard into the room. He looked absolutely terrible. His usually pristine golf tan was sallow, and his expensive tailored suit hung loosely on his frame. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world disintegrate overnight. Richard did not bother with a greeting. He slammed a thick stack of bank notices onto the glass conference table. He glared at me with absolute unfiltered rage. He shouted that the Internal Revenue Service had just frozen his personal retirement accounts, his country club memberships, and the joint checking accounts he shared with Beatrice. Because they were legally married, the federal asset seizure protocols, triggered by Beatrice's active participation in Harrison's tax evasion and mortgage fraud, had completely financially ruined him. He was entirely locked out of his own life, reduced to carrying a stack of declined debit cards. He pointed a trembling finger at my face and demanded that I fix the catastrophic mess I had created. He ordered me to wire $500,000 into an offshore account immediately so he could hire a top-tier federal defense attorney for Beatrice and secure a luxury rental property for himself. He actually attempted to use his deep patriarchal voice to intimidate me, insisting that a daughter was legally and morally obligated to rescue her parents when they were facing complete destitution. He claimed that blood was thicker than water and that I owed him my absolute loyalty because he gave me life. I stood on the opposite side of the glass table, completely unbothered by his desperate, thundering demands. I looked at the man who had ignored my existence for a decade unless he needed a new luxury car lease. I told him that blood might be thicker than water, but it was certainly not thicker than a federal indictment for aggravated identity theft. I calmly reminded him that I did not create this catastrophic mess. Harrison and Beatrice made the conscious, calculated decision to forge my signature on commercial bank documents to buy a $2.5 million mansion they could not afford. Richard slammed his fist against the table, the glass shuddering under the impact. He screamed that I was a cold, calculating monster. He threatened to disown me permanently. He yelled that if I did not transfer the funds right this second, he would legally strip me of the family name and ensure I was completely dead to him forever. He genuinely believed that the threat of his parental rejection still held power over me. I smiled a sharp, icy smile. I told him he could not disown a daughter he had already thrown away 10 years ago. I informed him that my name was the only thing standing between this company and the fraud his wife committed, and I would protect my legacy at all costs. I signaled the security guard standing by the door. I told Richard to take his declined credit cards and get out of my building. I explicitly advised him to start looking for a public defender because my bank accounts were officially closed to him for the rest of eternity. The guards grabbed his arms and hauled him toward the elevator. His desperate, echoing threats faded as the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing him out of my corporate headquarters and out of my life. Exactly 6 months later, the heavy mahogany doors of the federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta swung open. It had been half a year of relentless federal investigations, frozen assets, and high-profile media coverage that completely dismantled my family's fraudulent empire. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit. David sat beside me, his briefcase resting comfortably on the floor. Today was the official sentencing day, the final destination of the destructive path my mother and brother had chosen. Harrison and Beatrice were led into the courtroom by armed federal marshals. The stark reality of their extended stay in federal holding had entirely erased their polished, affluent facades. Harrison had lost a significant amount of weight. His cheekbones protruded sharply beneath his pale skin, and his eyes darted around the room with the frantic, terrified energy of a man who finally understood that his actions had permanent, inescapable consequences. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant groom who had dismissed me in the bridal suite. Beatrice looked entirely unrecognizable. The woman who had obsessed over designer labels and country club aesthetics now wore a drab, oversized institutional uniform. Her hair, previously maintained by weekly expensive salon appointments, was entirely gray and pulled back into a severe utilitarian knot. The haughty, commanding posture she used to intimidate waiters and event directors was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated slump. They were a portrait of absolute ruin. The presiding federal judge took his seat at the elevated bench. He did not look down at the defense table with a single ounce of sympathy. He spent the first 20 minutes of the hearing meticulously detailing the sheer audacity of their crimes. He described the forged commercial guarantee as a calculated malicious attack, not only on a federally insured banking institution, but on their own flesh and blood. The judge heavily emphasized that Beatrice had weaponized her state-granted authority as a notary public to facilitate a multi-million-dollar fraud solely to project a fabricated image of wealth. He called their actions a grotesque display of unmitigated greed and a profound betrayal of familial trust. When it was time to hand down the sentences, the entire courtroom fell dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. The judge ordered Harrison to stand. For the combined charges of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft, Harrison was sentenced to 36 months in a federal penitentiary, followed by 5 years of highly supervised release. Harrison collapsed back into his chair, his knees giving out beneath him. He buried his face in his trembling hands, sobbing openly. The reality of 3 years behind bars completely shattered his fragile ego. The judge then turned his steely gaze directly to Beatrice. He condemned her for enabling the fraud, actively participating in the identity theft of her own daughter, and attempting to destroy corporate property to cover her tracks. Beatrice was sentenced to 24 months in federal prison, along with the permanent revocation of all state licenses and a massive, crushing financial penalty. She did not scream or cry out as the sentence was read. She simply stared blankly at the polished wooden table, her spirit completely broken by the heavy, unyielding weight of the American justice system. The financial devastation extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Because of the staggering legal fees and the massive federal restitution orders, Richard was legally forced to liquidate absolutely everything. The sprawling suburban estate where I had grown up, the very house where they had constantly reminded me of my perceived shortcomings, was seized by the banks and sold at public auction. Richard, a man who had confidently marched into my office demanding a $500,000 offshore wire transfer, was now living in a cramped, dilapidated apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of Atlanta. His retirement accounts were entirely drained to satisfy the aggressive collection efforts of the Internal Revenue Service. He was completely ostracized from his elite social circles, wandering through his twilight years as a broke, disgraced pariah. Jasmine and her aristocratic family did not emerge unscathed either. Although her father had secured federal immunity by handing over the damning digital evidence, the social fallout in their exclusive Cascade neighborhood was absolute and unforgiving. The old money elite of Atlanta despised public scandal and financial fraud above all else. Jasmine was entirely shunned by her peers. Her perfectly curated reputation was permanently stained by her fleeting marriage to a convicted felon and her association with a highly publicized federal fraud case. The humiliation was so severe and suffocating that Jasmine was forced to pack her designer bags and relocate to an entirely different state, completely abandoning the high society kingdom she had tried so desperately to rule. I sat in the courtroom gallery and watched the federal marshals place my mother and brother back into heavy steel handcuffs. They were guided toward the side exit, shuffling slowly toward their respective prison transport vehicles. Not once did I feel a single pang of guilt. Not once did I question my decision to hand the evidence over to the authorities. They had forged my signature, attempted to steal my company, and plotted to ruin the lives of 50 innocent employees just to buy a luxury mansion they could never afford. The universe had not punished them, they had punished themselves, and the justice system had simply balanced the scales. David leaned over and quietly asked if I had seen enough. I nodded, standing up from the wooden gallery bench. The air in the courtroom felt incredibly light, as if a toxic fog had finally been ventilated from the room. We walked out through the heavy double doors and stepped into the bustling, sunlit hallway of the federal building. The long chapter of my life where I served as a disposable financial shield for toxic, manipulative relatives was officially closed. The heavy wooden gavel had fallen, the iron cell doors had locked, and I was stepping out into a brand new era of absolute, undeniable freedom. 2 weeks after sentencing, I received a notification from the Federal Corrections Facility just outside the city limits. It was a formal request for a visitor meeting. Beatrice used her limited privileges to submit my name to the warden. My instinct was to delete the email and continue running my logistics empire, but ignoring the request would leave a microscopic thread attached. I needed to look her in the eye one final time to sever the psychological umbilical cord she used to manipulate me. I told David to clear my morning schedule. I drove my sedan straight toward the razor wire fences of the federal penitentiary. The Visitor Processing Center was a masterclass in institutional degradation. I checked my coat and locked my phone inside a locker. I walked through 2 metal detectors and stood still while a guard swept a wand over my suit. The steel doors buzzed loudly, sliding open to reveal the visitation room. The walls were painted a nauseating shade of beige. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare across rows of bolted-down metal tables. I took a seat at assigned table number 4. I folded my hands on the cold steel surface and waited for the woman who brought me into the world to be escorted inside. 10 minutes later, the heavy door on the inmate's side groaned open. A female guard led Beatrice toward my table. The sight of my mother in this harsh reality was deeply jarring. The woman who spent decades curating a flawless country club aesthetic was gone. Her orange jumpsuit was ill-fitting and wrinkled. Her once pristine hair hung in flat, brittle strands. She looked fragile, ancient, and utterly defeated. She shuffled toward the stool across from me, her eyes darting nervously as if she expected wealthy socialites to suddenly appear and judge her wardrobe. She sat down heavily. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Beatrice stared at her own rough hands resting on the table. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes pooled with desperate, manipulative tears. She attempted to use her old tone, the one she deployed when she needed me to write a massive check to cover Harrison's debts. She leaned forward, her voice trembling with forced maternal affection, and told me how much she missed her daughter. I did not flinch. I did not offer a comforting smile. I stared at her with the cold, calculating detachment of a corporate executive evaluating a failed investment. I informed her that she did not miss her daughter. I told her she missed her unlimited credit card, her luxury vehicle lease, and the pristine social standing she purchased with my hard-earned money. Beatrice gasped, a look of profound betrayal crossing her features. She launched into a frantic, weeping defense of her actions. She claimed she was suffering horribly in the federal facility. She complained that the food was inedible, the guards were disrespectful, and the other inmates were terrifying. She begged me to contact David and hire appellate lawyers to overturn her conviction. She insisted she only notarized those forged mortgage documents because she was trying to secure a financial future for our family. She had the audacity to argue she took the fall for Harrison to protect me from having to support him financially for the rest of his life. The absolute delusion required to construct that narrative was staggering. I leaned across the cold metal table and delivered the brutal reality check she so desperately needed. I reminded her she used her notary seal to actively steal my corporate identity. I pointed out that she risked the financial ruin of 50 innocent employees just to buy a $2.5 million mansion to impress a family that annulled the marriage and left her son to rot. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring the surrounding guards could not hear the evisceration. I told her while Harrison was weeping in a federal cell block, my company secured 3 new commercial contracts. I informed her I was finalizing the legal paperwork to take my logistics tech firm public on the stock exchange. I explicitly stated my net worth had literally doubled since I cut the financial deadweight of her and Harrison out of my corporate accounts. The look of absolute horror on her face was deeply satisfying. The realization that I was wildly successful without her controlling influence completely shattered her remaining ego. Beatrice began to sob uncontrollably, dropping her head onto her arms. She cried out that she had absolutely nothing left. She wailed that Richard was living in a dilapidated apartment and refusing to answer her calls. She begged me to deposit money into her prison commissary account so she could buy basic necessities. She pleaded for a sliver of mercy, claiming she was an old woman who would likely die in this miserable facility. I stood up from the metal stool and smoothed the front of my tailored suit jacket. I looked down at the weeping woman who spent my entire life calling me a profound disappointment for failing to secure a wealthy husband. I told her she was currently paying the exact price for her own toxic choices. I informed her there was no mercy left in my account, and there were no blank checks waiting to rescue her from her own malicious greed. I turned my back on her and walked toward the heavy steel exit doors. I did not look over my shoulder when she screamed my name. I did not pause when the correction officers instructed her to remain seated. I stepped through the buzzing security doors, retrieved my belongings, and walked out into the brilliant Georgia sunshine. The final microscopic thread connecting me to that toxic lineage was permanently severed. I got into my expensive luxury car, started the engine, and drove back to the city. I was now completely ready to conquer the world entirely on my own absolute terms. The drive back into the heart of Atlanta felt like a victory lap. The air conditioning in the car blasted against my skin, washing away the lingering stench of the federal visitation room. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the smooth leather under my palms, recognizing that I was the only person steering the direction of my life now. The skyline loomed ahead, a glittering monument to ambition and resilience. For the first time in my 33 years, I looked at the towering glass structures and saw pure opportunity instead of financial obligation. I had spent a decade building an empire while chained to an anchor, and now that the heavy steel links were shattered, there was absolutely no limit to how high I could climb. 6 months passed in a brilliant, uninterrupted blur of corporate expansion and personal peace. Autumn swept through Georgia, turning the city foliage into vibrant shades of amber and gold. Tonight was not just another Friday evening. It was a massive celebration. My logistics technology firm had officially gone public on the stock exchange that morning. The initial public offering exceeded our most aggressive financial projections, cementing my status as a self-made industry leader. I was hosting a private dinner at my Midtown penthouse, not to impress high society elites or secure a fake social standing, but to share my absolute triumph with the people who actually mattered. The penthouse was bathed in warm, inviting light. A private chef I hired for the occasion was putting the final touches on a spectacular 5-course meal in the open marble kitchen. Soft jazz played through the integrated sound system, creating an atmosphere of effortless elegance. There were no tense whispers, no performative maternal critiques, and absolutely no looming threat of financial extortion. My home was finally a true sanctuary, a space entirely devoid of toxic manipulation. The private elevator chimed softly, signaling the arrival of my first guests. The heavy metal doors slid open, and David stepped into the foyer, accompanied by his husband, Michael. David held up a bottle of incredibly rare vintage champagne, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. He pulled me into a genuine warm embrace, congratulating me on the staggering success of the market launch. Michael handed me a beautiful bouquet of white orchids, complementing the panoramic view of the glowing city below. They did not look at me like a walking bank account. They looked at me with profound, unfiltered pride, valuing my presence far more than my checkbook. Shortly after the elevator chimed again, Victor, my brilliant head of corporate cybersecurity, walked in alongside Naomi, my chief operating officer. Victor was the man who had immediately detected Harrison and Beatrice attempting to breach the executive suite. He had fiercely protected my digital infrastructure, proving his absolute loyalty when it mattered most. Naomi had flawlessly managed our global supply chain during the chaotic media fallout of the federal indictments, ensuring our clients never felt a single ripple of the family disaster. They were not just my employees, they were the steadfast guardians of my life's work and my peace of mind. We gathered around the expansive dining table, the floor-to-ceiling windows providing a breathtaking backdrop of the Atlanta skyline. The chef served plates of seared scallops, perfectly roasted Wagyu beef, and delicate truffle risotto. The conversation flowed with a natural, joyful rhythm. We laughed about the stressful late nights preparing the initial public offering paperwork. We shared stories of our early career struggles and toasted to the brilliant future ahead of us. There was no underlying tension, no hidden agendas, and no desperate pleas for offshore wire transfers. Every person at this table had earned their seat through mutual respect and unwavering support. As the chef cleared the main course plates, David stood up and tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The room quieted down, everyone turning their attention to the man who had flawlessly executed my legal retaliation. David raised his glass high, looking directly at me. He spoke with deep, unwavering respect. He praised my resilience, noting that many people would have completely crumbled under the weight of such a massive, orchestrated betrayal. He commended my fierce dedication to my company and my refusal to let toxic individuals compromise my professional and personal integrity. David stated that the success of the stock launch today was not just a financial victory. It was the ultimate proof that surviving abuse and severing toxic ties opens the door to unimaginable prosperity. He toasted to my strength, to the bright future of the company, and to the absolute power of choosing your own destiny. Victor, Naomi, and Michael raised their glasses in unison, echoing his heartfelt sentiments with genuine smiles. I stood up holding my own glass, deeply moved by the genuine affection radiating from the people sitting at my table. I looked at David, who had protected my wealth with the ferocity of a shark. I looked at Victor, who had defended my physical and digital safety without a second thought. I looked at Naomi, who had stood by my side, keeping the business running smoothly while my world threatened to collapse. I addressed the table, my voice thick with raw, unfiltered gratitude. I told them that for a very long time I believed family was strictly defined by biology. I had internalized the damaging lie that sharing DNA meant accepting endless abuse and financial extortion. I explained that because of their unwavering loyalty, I finally understood the true definition of family. Family is not a mandatory obligation you are born into. Family is a deliberate choice. Family is comprised of the people who fiercely protect your peace, who celebrate your victories without a single ounce of jealousy, and who stand right beside you when the federal authorities are called to the lobby. I raised my glass toward them, thanking them for being the most incredible chosen family a woman could ever ask for. We clinked our crystal flutes together, the clear ringing sound symbolizing a brand new era of absolute freedom. We spent the rest of the evening eating decadent chocolate dessert and looking out over the city lights. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the profound comfort of the room. The ghosts of my past were locked away in federal prison cells and dilapidated apartments, entirely powerless to reach me. I was surrounded by absolute trust, undeniable success, and a love that was completely unconditional. I had built my own empire, and more importantly, I had built my own true family. The final guests left my penthouse just after midnight. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving me standing in the center of my massive living room. I did not feel the usual exhaustion that follows a large social gathering. Instead, I felt an incredible surge of boundless energy. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed my palm against the cool glass. The city of Atlanta stretched out beneath me, an endless grid of glowing streetlights and soaring skyscrapers. Down there, millions of people were sleeping, dreaming, or fighting their own private battles. A year ago, I was one of them, silently suffocating under the crushing weight of familial obligation. I had allowed the accident of my birth to dictate my financial and emotional boundaries. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to fund an illusion of aristocratic grandeur for a mother and brother who viewed me as nothing more than a highly efficient piece of banking machinery. Tonight, looking out over the sprawling metropolis, I finally understood the true scale of my liberation. The air in my home felt lighter. The silence was no longer a threat waiting to be broken by a frantic phone call or a demanded wire transfer. It was a profound, healing quiet. I poured myself one final glass of sparkling water and walked out onto the expansive terrace. The crisp night air rushed over me. I looked up at the starless urban sky and took a deep breath. I thought about the sheer audacity of my mother standing on that wedding stage, mocking my single status to a room full of strangers. She had fundamentally misunderstood the power of a woman who answers to no one but herself. She assumed that without a husband, I was somehow incomplete and an easy target for financial extortion and psychological manipulation. She learned the hard way that a woman standing alone is not a target. She is an absolute fortress. My thoughts briefly drifted to the cold federal detention center sitting miles away on the industrial outskirts of the city. Beatrice and Harrison were currently locked inside small concrete cells, completely stripped of their designer clothes and their inflated egos. They were waking up to the harsh metallic sounds of prison life, eating bland cafeteria food, and facing the devastating reality of the years stretching ahead of them. Richard was likely sitting in his cramped, dilapidated apartment, staring at a stack of declined credit cards and IRS penalty notices. Jasmine was in another state, desperately trying to scrub the stain of a federal fraud scandal from her prestigious family name. They had all played a dangerous game of deception, and the house had finally won. But I refused to spend another second dwelling on their misery. Their destruction was a closed chapter, a necessary amputation to save the rest of my life. I was no longer the designated survivor of their toxic dynamics. I was the architect of my own extraordinary future. I turned my back on the glittering skyline and walked back inside my beautiful, quiet penthouse. I placed my empty glass in the sink and headed toward my bedroom. As I prepared for sleep, I realized I did not need to set an alarm for the next morning. My company was public, my assets were secure, my schedule was entirely my own. The defensive armor I had worn for 10 long years was finally unbuckled and cast aside. I slid under the soft linen sheets and closed my eyes, drifting into the most restful, undisturbed sleep I had experienced in my entire adult life. The next morning, I woke up to the soft morning sunlight warming my face. I did not reach for my phone to check for emergency text messages. I did not brace myself for a daily crisis. I simply lay there enjoying the sheer luxury of absolute peace. I was ready to step into the next phase of my journey. The logistics company I built from nothing was now a publicly traded powerhouse, but my ambitions did not stop there. I planned to launch a philanthropic foundation aimed at supporting young female entrepreneurs, providing them with the resources and legal guidance they need to protect their businesses from predatory exploitation. I wanted to ensure that no other woman ever felt forced to sacrifice her hard-earned success to appease manipulative relatives. The trauma of my past was no longer an anchor holding me down. It had been forged into a razor-sharp sword, a weapon of advocacy and unyielding strength. I rose from my bed, walked into my expansive closet, and selected a sharply tailored navy blue suit. Today was a new day, the absolute beginning of a brilliant era. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was not a victim. She was a conqueror. She had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged completely victorious. I am 33 years old, entirely single, and absolutely free. I learned the absolute hardest possible way that you can never ever buy the love of people who only see you as a transaction. Do not let anyone weaponize the concept of family to turn you into a financial instrument. Genuine respect must always be entirely mutual. If people around you refuse to honor your boundaries, you must possess the fierce courage to revoke their access to your life entirely. You hold the absolute ultimate power to sever the cord and walk away completely unscathed. Have you ever been forced to use the legal system to permanently punish toxic relatives who attempted to exploit your hard work and steal your future? Have you ever had to absolutely destroy a toxic family dynamic to protect your own life and your own sanity? Please leave your story in the comments section below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible journeys of reclaiming power and demanding absolute justice. The narratives shared above powerfully illustrate that shared DNA does not automatically guarantee unconditional love, loyalty, or protection. Focusing on Blanche's journey, we see this harsh reality unfold when her mother chose a luxury vacation with a new husband over her own daughter, leaving a 15-year-old stranded at an airport with just $200. This devastating betrayal shatters the societal illusion that a biological parent will inherently prioritize their child's well-being, teaching us that we cannot force people to value us or tie our self-worth to the limitations of those incapable of offering genuine care. However, the profound beauty of this story lies in its revelation about resilience and the true definition of family. Blanche's father, who had been systematically alienated by her mother's manipulations, immediately dropped everything to rescue her the moment she reached out for help. Through his unwavering support, he proved that real family is built strictly on action, on showing up in moments of crisis, validating a person's worth, and making the consistent choice to prioritize one another. Blanche's transformation from feeling like excess baggage into an empowered advocate for children of divorce demonstrates that our future is never defined by those who abandon us. We possess the power to break toxic cycles, establish firm boundaries, and redefine our support systems on our own terms. True healing begins when we stop seeking validation from empty wells and start surrounding ourselves with people who actively choose us every single day. If you are currently holding on to a toxic relationship out of a sense of biological obligation, take a moment today to evaluate who truly shows up for you and give yourself permission to invest your energy only in those who respect and uplift you.